Today is January 19, 2018, and earlier we just had a wonderful new moon meeting, and tonight we may talk more about that or get into another subject, depending on what's needed. But before anything, let's ask our Heavenly Family to guide us. Heavenly Family, thank you so very much for guiding us step by step and for helping us as we climb out of this pit of ignorance to gain a real knowledge about such essential things as who you are, that you are, and how to go about living and loving and bettering the world. Please correct all of our misconceptions. Please help us to be able to have the mindset and the motivations that will bring about real change in the world. Guide us in tonight's discussion. Please help us to forward ourselves and each other as much as possible and to follow your lead in coming to an understanding. Thank you. We ask this, Father and Mother, B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch, he and she. Amen. Okay, so, as I mentioned earlier today, on tonight's call we would start with seeing whether anyone has any sort of comments or questions related to the new moon meeting earlier, which had to do with establishing who Jesus was, what he was like, what his message was, the sort of things that he did and said. We talked about some of the principles involved in doing that and some of the sources that we have available to us which greatly benefit us in being able to accomplish such a task. And particularly, we looked at the Odes of Solomon. We spent a great deal of time on the Gospel of John as well, but we really focused in on the Odes of Solomon and used Ode 10 as a case study in order to see something about the historical Jesus. So, with that said, does anyone have any comments or questions related to the new moon topic? And if you do not, feel free to mention that as well, and then I'll explain the other topic that I have in mind for us to look at.
I think we're good here.
Okay, excellent. And thank you for replying. And since no one else said anything, then I'll explain what we're going to get into separate from the new moon topic then. What I had in mind dovetails with our recent discussions on materialism, and those discussions ended up including questions of how we come to know things, which is typically known as epistemology, the study of knowledge, how we come to know. And when we had our discussions on materialism, and I noticed that many of you kind of went from that and merged that subject into how we can come to know things in general, I kind of saw that it would be beneficial for us to go through a testimony by Ellen White in Testimonies Volume 3 called Experience Not Reliable. It starts on page 67 of Testimonies for the Church, Volume 3. I'll just mention also that there's another reason why I was thinking it would be good to go through this, and that is that Teresa and I have been going through some of the Timeless Testimonies videos again, the videos that Teresa has made for the Timeless Testimonies YouTube channel. And in looking through those testimonies and in discussing the principles related to it, and also going through the series of videos on the Seven Angels Messages channel called Genuine Experience, all of that together definitely pointed us in the direction of experience not reliable. I've mentioned several times that Ellen White's comments in Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, are some of my favorite comments anywhere by anyone, because therein she explains a certain epistemology, a certain way to come to know, that is the only genuine way. That is by means of a variety of careful experiments. And in that passage, she actually advocates the scientific method very, very clearly. And it's just the reason why I love that statement so much and why I love this overall subject so much is because it is a guide to know how to do everything else. If we do not have experiment and do not have a reliable way to come to knowledge, then we are literally going around without chart and compass. We could end up anywhere. Just earlier today, I mentioned to Teresa, in just discussing some principles, how, magical thinking can make anything seem reasonable. And I think all of us who have been studying this message may have some level of understanding of how that is the case, because we have all had magical thinking without even realizing it. And within that magical thinking, there are things, I know for me, there are things that I, at one point, thought to be entirely reliable ideas, which now I realize is just so unrealistic. And it's amazing to me that I ever thought that such things were reasonable, when now I see them to be just as unreasonable as doing the rain dance. With all that said, Testimonies Volume 3, Experience Not Reliable, starting on page 67, is such an incredible section of the testimonies for us to go through. This is the quarry from which Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, was dug. In other words, it came first. Testimonies 3 did. And Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene took some of the statements from this testimony, and Ellen White edited her own statements to be more fitting for that context, and ended up with this very nice, concise statement concerning experiment and experience. But here in this testimony, it is more fully explored. These ideas are more fully explained, even though it is kind of mixed with the experiences and circumstances of a particular individual at a particular time. So it's less focused on just explaining the principle, because it's also dealing with specific circumstances. Thus, I think that both statements are very, very important and helpful. And since we have had a thorough examination of Christian Temperance and Bible Hygiene, page 109, within the Genuine Experience video series, I think it's about time that we have a thorough examination of experience not reliable. And one of the things that I want us to really glean from this is how Ellen White deals with knowledge and how she deals with science. Because there is, in the branch movement, in the Davidian movement, and in the Seventh-day Adventist movement, and actually among religious folk generally, not to include every individual in this, but generally speaking, there is a thread of thought or a line of thinking which views science and experimental method in a negative light.
Trent, can I get you to repeat that last sentence, please? I don't know if anybody else needed that, but something happened and it went blurry.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, not a problem. There is, within the branch, within Davidia, and within Adventism, and also among religious folks in general, although I'm not intending to include every single individual in this, but generally speaking, among all of the aforesaid movements, there is a thread of thought, there is a line of thinking which generally views science and the experimental approach to knowledge in a negative light. There is an anti-science perspective that has found its way into the thoughts of many people, including those of us here in this very movement. And this is something that we need to have corrected. And this testimony from Ellen White is so very pointed in this regard. I want you all to remember the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, The Detrimental Effects of Immaterialism Upon Reasonable Thinking, and how in that article we went through several different fields of knowledge and applied the principles of materialism and immaterialism to those various fields in order to put us in a place where we cannot deceive ourselves into thinking that we are applying the principles of materialism while at the same time disregarding its application in certain areas. And each individual has their own areas where they are more inclined to have a desire not to apply the principles of materialism. For some people, they may not really want to apply the principles fully when it comes to politics. For others, when it comes to health. For others, when it comes to archaeology. It really depends on people's biases, and if someone has something to lose. If you have a treasured way of thinking or acting, some sort of personal, emotional investment in political views which are not experimentally substantiated and which run counter to the counsel that we have been given in the message, well then that's an area where you may be tempted not to apply these principles. And likewise, whatever the area is for each individual. This time, though, I'm not so much wanting to focus just on specific areas, but I want to highlight what this is, and hopefully to do so using terminology that brings it to light in a more clear way. Because in reality, what materialism demands in terms of how we come to knowledge is the scientific method, namely experiment, careful experiment. Hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, getting rid of biases, etc., etc. We've talked about this experimental method quite a bit, but I want to emphasize the use of the term science in that regard throughout the course of our looking into experience not reliable. And as you will see, Ellen White uses the term science in this testimony as well, and is advocating a very pro-science perspective. And the reason why I am wanting to focus on that element is because, again, of the anti-science perspective that has been prevalent among us prior even to studying this message. And it will be very good for us to see our own misconceptions in regard to science, and we basically need to learn to look at it in a different way from how we have in the past. So with all that said, I'll read the first part of Experience Not Reliable, and we can discuss it as we go. Now, in this testimony, Ellen White is relating to a woman specifically in regard to her health, and is bringing forward principles related to false experience in contrast with genuine experience, really within the context of health, but she does broaden these principles beyond that realm, and perhaps we will take it even further. So again, Testimonies 3, page 67. Experience Not Reliable. Dear Sister N, in the view given me, December 10, 1871, I saw that some things had been great hindrances to your recovery of health. Your peculiar traits of character have prevented you from receiving the good you might have received, and from improving in health as you might have improved. You have a special routine to go through, and you will not be turned aside from it. You have your ideas, which you carry out, when frequently they are not in harmony with physical law, but simply with your judgment. That's the end of the first paragraph of this particular section of the Testimonies. And I just want to highlight some things here, namely that Ellen White is pointing out to this individual that she was just going with her own ideas, her own judgment, and not using physical law as her standard. I hope that you can see the principles regarding materialism and immaterialism and how they are at the center of this particular problem which Ellen White was dealing with. Again, the problem was that this woman was hindering herself because she had her own way of doing things and she wouldn't turn aside from that, and she just kept doing it that way because it was according to her own judgment, even though her ideas were not in harmony with physical law. So Ellen White evidently has a problem with this, and she's wanting to help this woman by pointing her to the fact that she is making decisions and living a certain way, not based on material reality, but based on her own judgments. This is really at the heart of the matter. With immaterialism leads one to find something other than material reality as the basis upon which they are to make their decisions and come to an understanding of what is true and what is good. And as we have seen in a multitude of studies, that does not lead to truth. And that does not lead to righteousness, or well-being. That which is good is that which is in harmony with material reality, or as Ellen White puts it here, physical law. This is Ellen White definitely expressing her materialist philosophy and how it applies to determining what one should do with their health. What should we do with our health? Should it be what we think is right according to our judgment and our own ideas? Well, if reality was such that there's this whole other realm aside from the physical, and our well-being had to do with our harmony with that realm, well, maybe it would be according to our own feelings and our own ideas and our own preferences. But in a world in which all that is material, then physical law must be the determining factor as to what is good and what is not good for our health. So Ellen White's materialism is informing her counsel to Sister N, as she is here called. Continuing on, you have a strong mind and a set will, and you think you understand your own case better than others can, because you trace your feelings. You are guided by your feelings and are governed by your experience. Now, at this point, many might think, well, what's wrong with that? Why is Ellen White even having a problem with this? But I want you to realize, as individuals who profess the inspiration of Ellen White, I want you to realize that Ellen White, in this testimony, is expressing a problem in principle with someone thinking that they understand their own case better than others and being guided by their own experience and their feelings. When it comes to health, many people want to say, well, I know my body. I know because I've experienced it. As we will see as we progress through this testimony, that is precisely the mindset which Sister N had. Sister W, on the other hand, was called to give Sister N a reproof, a rebuke, a correction to that mindset. Ellen White is saying, no, we should not consider our own experience reliable and think that we understand our case better than others can. Obviously, since Ellen White is objecting to the idea that we can understand our case better than others can, it automatically implies that there may be somebody who understands your case better than you do. Well, we might not like that. That may grind against our emotions and against our own preferences and biases. It may make us feel insecure. It's a secure feeling to think that we are the best judge of our own case. And we don't like being told that there may very well be others who can know our case better than we can. Health, as an example, really shows the point. You may have someone who believes that they know what they're doing with their health, but who really doesn't, and there may be people who are simply more knowledgeable in regard to the operations of the human body and the chemical interactions which take place by putting certain substances into it or by doing certain things with the body overall or some particular part of the body. So we all, in order to really be in harmony with material reality, we all need to be of the mindset that there may be someone who knows more about our own case in regard to health and in regard to other things than we do. There may be someone who really knows more, and we may need to be corrected. There may be someone who is more knowledgeable about health and physical law related to the body, who might be able to say, hey, look, experimentally, this is the case. We know this by means of experiment. And while you have your own philosophy in regard to health, it is not experimentally verified. Therefore, here's what the experiment says to do. And we need to be willing to go with the experiment. I'll give an example, actually, that is in the Silver Trumpet. And I'm mentioning this for the principle, and I really want you guys to understand the principle. And if the example that I'm going to use raises your defenses, then that is your cue to realize that that's a subject upon which you have a bias, and that it's time to really try and understand the principles and to not try and raise your defenses, but to just try and follow the truth. So the example that I'll give is vaccination. Many people have opinions regarding vaccination that are predominantly informed by their political views rather than some sort of experimental knowledge regarding vaccinations. So we should all be of the mindset that even if we have been accustomed to being against vaccination, we need to be of the mindset that we won't have our own preference or our own experience. Perhaps we ourselves had a bad experience with vaccinations or someone else did. We need to be of the mindset that we will not consider our experiences or the stories we have heard from others as being reliable. Why? Because, as the title of the testimony says, experience not reliable. And as Ellen White will get into, what is needed to have genuine knowledge is rigorous scientific experiment. And no matter how much we may have strong feelings, and no matter how much we may base those feelings upon our experience or the experience of others, if someone could come to us and present us with scientific experimental data which showed that our view on vaccination is incorrect, then we need to accept what that scientific experimental data says and discard our own ideas and preferences based on our so-called experience or our feelings. Because again, listen to what Ellen White says here. You have a strong mind and set will, and you think you understand your own case better than others can because you trace your feelings. You are guided by your feelings and are governed by your experience. Again, Ellen White is rebuking this woman for this. So we may do that in regard to vaccination or some other thing related to another aspect of health or in regard to something else. But notice, we need to be people who do not just rely on our own experience. And in fact, we all know that this is not a reliable means of arriving at truth because we recognize that other people have false experiences. We realize that there are people out there who believe that they are being healed by using spiritualistic methods. We realize that there are people out there who go to faith healers and who actually experience a huge relief of their pain or their condition reverses or whatever. And even those faith healers may be proven to be frauds, and yet people will still cling to their experience. So my point is, whether it's something which you recognize as fraudulent or spiritualistic or not, the method, the way of approaching how to come to a conclusion is what is most important. And if you are basing your views upon experience, upon your personal experience and your own views, rather than on scientific experimental data, then you need to realize that your perspectives are no better, no more valid than the person who is believing their faith healer. The person who is thinking that they just had an experience where their deceased loved one visited them, or the person who is using some other sort of spiritualistic means to improve their perception of their own health. To continue on with what Ellen White here says, you have tried this and that plan to your entire satisfaction, and have decided that your judgment was best to follow in your own case. But what has been your standard? Answer your feelings. Now, my sister, what have your feelings to do with the real facts in the case? But very little. Feelings are a poor criterion, especially when under the control of a strong imagination and firm will. You have a very determined mind, and your course is mapped out before you, but you do not view your case from a correct standpoint. Your judgment is not safe to be relied upon when it relates to your own case. Notice that Ellen White is pointing out that there's this bias. And let's not just say that this just applied to Sister N. No, this applies to all of us. When it comes to our own case, we are less likely to be able to see things as they are, because our own judgment will get in the way. Now, one thing that I want you to consider is this. Do you think that Sister N felt like she was going by her feelings? Well, no, Sister White, you're misunderstanding me. I'm not going by my feelings. I just know my body. Isn't that the response that we would all want to give? That we are not going by our feelings? I highly doubt that Sister N felt like she was going by her feelings, or thought she was going by her feelings. So it is upon each one of you to examine yourself to see whether you are going by your feelings, and keep in mind that you are not the best judge of that. You are not the best judge to even see whether you are going by your feelings. Just like Sister N may have justified herself thinking, well, I'm not going by my feelings. No, I know based on my experience. But look what Ellen White is saying. Ellen White is saying going by your feelings and going by your experience are the same thing. So if you are going by your own personal experience, rather than forming your beliefs and making your decisions based upon scientific experimental data, then you are going by your feelings. And it is so important for us to not do that. Again, this principle, as it applies in the realm of health, applies to every other realm. And as we've seen in this message, acting out of harmony with material reality, acting contrary to the principles of material reality, is what sin really is. Acting in harmony with physical law, acting in harmony with the principles of material reality, is what it means to do what is right. And how can we know physical reality? How can we know these principles? Only by a variety of careful experiments, not by our own experience. What people call experience is not experience at all, and that's a statement from Ellen White, which we will be getting into. Too often people use the term experience to simply refer to experiences through which they passed and their perceptions through those circumstances. We call that experience, and we take that as a reliable guide. If we take the experiences through which we pass and our response to those experiences and our perspectives about those experiences while they happen as a reliable guide to know what to do and to know what is true, we could end up believing anything. We could end up validating in our minds things which cannot be validated in reality. Why? Because that type of experience is not reliable. There are many, many examples of this. Just consider a mirage. Your senses tell you one thing, but that is not actually a reflection of reality. And of course, a mirage is something real, but it tricks our senses. We think that we are experiencing something that we are not experiencing. That is not a reflection of material reality. I don't know how many here know this, but the sunrise and sunset, we can experience this every day, sunrise and sunset, but sunrise is a mirage. Sunset is a mirage. When you first see the sun coming over the horizon, you think that you're looking at the sun, right? At that moment, and you're seeing the sun. But in fact, it is an actual mirage that you're seeing. It's not actually that you're looking directly at the sun. It's simply that the gravity of Earth has bent the rays of light coming from the sun to go over the horizon. And so what you see as the sun is just the bending of light from the sun due to gravity. Your experience may tell you that, oh, that's actually the sun that I'm directly looking at, but that's not the case. We all know what it's like to park next to a vehicle, and when we don't expect it, they suddenly start driving in reverse, and we feel like we're moving forward. Experience is not reliable. Things can seem a certain way and yet not be that way. When you are standing outside, it feels like you're not moving at all, when in fact the earth is spinning very fast. Just like if you are on a large plane or in a large boat, let's say you're in a large boat and it's a very still day and you can't feel the waves. The boat may be moving, it may be traveling, and you may be on a journey, but you may feel like you're not moving at all. Same thing as when you're standing out on the ground. When you are in an enclosed environment and your movement in relation to things within your environment is the same as their movement, it seems like you're not moving at all. That's just the way it is. That's how it seems, but that's not a reflection of reality. When you see the light of the sun, you are seeing photons, little particles that left the sun 8 minutes ago. It feels like you're just seeing exactly what's happening at this moment. But what you are seeing happening with the sun is actually 8 minutes in the past. These are just some examples, and there's so many more that could be given, just to show that the way things seem to be from the experiences through which we pass and our perception of those experiences or of those circumstances as we pass through them, that perception, that type of experience is not reliable. It is not a good indicator of what things are actually like in material reality. Thus, we have to put things to the test. That's really what we need to do. We need to conduct scientific experiments in order to establish what reality is really like. So again, Ellen White, in this testimony, is counseling Sister N to not rely upon her own judgment, to not rely upon her so-called experience, because they are not reliable. Why? Because they are not in harmony with physical law. And how do we establish physical law? Experiment. I'll go to the next paragraph. I was shown that you had made some improvement, but not as much, as fast, or as thorough as you might, because you take your case into your own hands. Isn't that what we all want to do? We want to take things into our own hands. We want to take control of our own health. That's what this woman was doing. She was taking control of her own health, and Eleanor was like, wait a second. No, you should not rely on yourself to be able to take control of your own health, because your experience is not reliable. Continuing, for this reason, and that you feel it your duty to be guided by the judgment of the more experienced, I wish you to come to the Health Institute. So notice Ellen White is saying, because you are taking your case into your own hands and feeling that your own judgment is reliable, because of that, and because Ellen White wanted her to feel it her duty to be guided by the judgment of the more experienced, because of that, she wished that Sister N would come to the Health Institute. So notice, Ellen White wanted Sister N to come to the Health Institute, and she gave two main reasons for wanting that. The first thing is because Sister N was relying upon her own experience, and Ellen White was saying, no, you shouldn't be doing that. The second thing is that she wanted Sister N to feel it her duty to be guided by the judgment of the more experienced. So Ellen White was not advocating at all for this woman or for any other person to follow their own judgment in regard to health. No, she advocated to follow genuine experience, which is established by experimental methodology, as we are about to find out. The next sentence, Ellen White says, the physicians of the Health Institute understand disease, its causes, and proper treatment better than you can. And if you will yield your set ideas willingly and abide by their judgment, there is hope of your recovery. But if you refuse to do this, I see no hope of your becoming what you might be with proper treatment. So notice, Ellen White is pointing to the experience of these physicians as being superior because they had a better understanding of disease, its causes, and its proper treatment than this woman had or could have. Now, you may have your anti-science advocate within you wanting to say, well, yeah, but that doesn't apply to doctors today or to physicians today. But who are we kidding? Medical knowledge has advanced tremendously. And if we honestly think that we understand more about our own health and more about disease, its causes, and its proper treatment than the multitude of chemists and biologists who have devoted their lives and gone through rigorous education in order to participate in medical research, if we think that our experience is as good or better than theirs, then we are just proud. Honestly, it is a matter of pride. Because in reality, most of us don't know anything in regard to disease, its true operations, and its proper treatments and its causes compared to what physicians really know because of their education. And we may have this anti-education idea in our minds. But this is what we're going through this for. If you, as we're going through this, are finding yourself having your defenses raised and you want to kind of disagree and stick to your own perspective, which may be anti-education, anti-science, anti-conventional medicine, as it were, then just realize that that's your sign that you have a bias and that this testimony is especially for you. Because that's exactly what Ellen White is addressing. She's addressing this very issue, and if you find yourself resistant to it in this message, just realize that this message is doing nothing more than drawing your attention to the teachings of the message which you already profess through the writings of Ellen White. And let's not fool ourselves to think that we believe Ellen White's message and yet discard her counsel on this point, when she is so specifically telling this woman not to rely upon her own experience, but to rely upon the experience of others because of their acquaintance with physical laws, in this instance, regarding disease, its causes, and proper treatments. Continuing on, Ellen White says, "As I have before stated, you, my sister, rely upon experience. Your experience decides you to pursue a certain course, but that which many term experience is not experience at all. It is simply habit or mere indulgence, blindly and frequently ignorantly followed, with a firm set determination and without intelligent thought or inquiry relative to the laws at work in the accomplishment of the result." Notice what Ellen White is really saying here. Let's not be people who will cling to our own experience and be set and determined and firm that we're just going to follow this experience. That type of mindset is the mindset which has not fallen in love with truth. Again, truth is that which comports to material reality. If you find yourself fighting against these principles, let it be a revelation to you that you do not love truth as you should. Because if you did, why would your defenses rise simply from someone saying, let's not go by our own experience, let's really validate everything by real scientific experiment? If we really care about truth, those experiments will only be for our benefit. We'll love to do that because we'll want to know the truth. That's it. If we don't like that idea, if we don't like the idea of having to rely upon actual scientific experiment and to discard our own so-called experience, it just shows that we care about our own preferences and our own ideas more than we care about truth. This is exactly what our Heavenly Family wants to come face to face with. And they've been wanting this for a very long time. There's a statement that I included from Ellen White in the Silver Trumpet, Volume 1, Number 9, that explains this very principle and process. This is a statement from Spiritual Gifts, Volume 2, page 225. please listen to what this is saying. And especially if you find yourself having an internal struggle over the content of tonight's call, please really consider this statement. God leads his people on step by step. He brings them up to different points which are calculated to manifest what is in the heart. Some endure at one point but fall off at the next. At every advanced point, the heart is tested and tried a little closer. If the professed people of God find their hearts opposed to the straight work of God, it should convince them that they have a work to do to overcome, or be spewed out of the mouth of the Lord. Said the angel, God will bring his work closer and closer to test them and prove every one of his people. Some are willing to receive one point, but when God brings them to another testing point, they shrink from it and stand back because they find it strikes directly at some cherished idol. Here they have opportunity to see what is in their hearts that shuts out Jesus. They prize something higher than the truth, and their hearts are not prepared to receive Jesus. Notice, if you are prizing something higher than the truth, it's showing you that your hearts are not prepared to receive Jesus, because Jesus is all about truth. Continuing with this statement in spiritual gifts. Individuals are tested and proved a length of time to see if they will sacrifice their idols and heed the counsel of the true witness. If they will not be purified through obeying the truth, that which comports to material reality, and overcome their selfishness, their pride, their evil passions, the angels of God have their charge. They are joined to their idols, let them alone. And they pass on to their work, leaving them with their evil traits unsubdued to the control of evil angels. Those who come up to every point and stand every test and overcome, be the price what it may, have heeded the counsel of the true witness, and they will be fitted by the latter rain for translation. I believe that this statement captures very well the importance of what we're doing on the call tonight. And I hope that you are glimpsing that. I hope that it's more than a small glimpse. I hope that you are forcing yourself to stare that reality in the face and to deal with it, to allow the light from the Son of Righteousness to scorch and burn away the chaff of your own preferences and biases, which take you away from the truth. I want to read at least this next paragraph from Testimonies 3, this time on page 69. It's just the next paragraph in this section, Experience Not Reliable. Ellen White says, real experience is a variety of careful experiments made with the mind freed from prejudice and uncontrolled by previously established opinions and habits. The results are marked with careful solicitude and an anxious desire to learn, to improve, and to reform on every habit that is not in harmony with physical and moral laws. The idea of others gainsaying what you have learned by experience seems to you to be folly and even cruelty itself. But there are more errors received and firmly retained from false ideas of experience than from any other cause, for the reason that what is generally termed experience is not experience at all, because there has never been a fair trial by actual experiment and thorough investigation with a knowledge of the principles involved in the action. On that last point, Ellen White, speaking of a knowledge of the principles involved in the action, in the previous paragraph, Ellen White had said a very similar thing. She said, without intelligent thought or inquiry relative to the laws at work in the accomplishment of the result. So what this is dealing with is really the difference between so-called experience and genuine experience. There may be something that you are doing that you think is good for your health, but you don't actually have a knowledge of how the atoms of what you are putting into your body are interacting with the atoms of your cells that make up your body. And you may think that what you are doing is good without a knowledge of what's really going on. And there may be people out there, most likely people who are actually working with microscopes, who do have a knowledge of it, who have gained a knowledge of these laws that are at work in our own bodies by means of the scientific method, by conducting actual experiments and by submitting those experiments to the peer review process for others to duplicate, to criticize, to falsify, or verify. That is what is reliable. Actual experiment, not just going through things, not just taking something and feeling better and thinking that what you took is what made you feel better because there was a correlation. No, correlation doesn't prove causation, right? We've talked about this. It deals with logical fallacies and so on. No, the only way to really know is to conduct actual experiments. Notice that Ellen White uses the phrase actual experiment. Obviously, that sets a contrast between actual experiment and something that is not actual experiment. An actual experiment is something that is carefully planned out. It's not something that you're just doing something and seeing what happens. No, that's not an actual experiment. An actual experiment is very carefully thought out and designed in order to cancel out our biases, in order to discover the real physical laws at work. We should have a knowledge of the principles involved in the action. So we're dealing with stuff that relates to health? Well, guess what? All of that boils down to biochemistry. That is what it boils down to. Biochemistry is an actual field of science where people conduct actual experiments. Let's not view our own circumstances and our perspectives through those circumstances as being as of more value or equal reliability to the multitude of experiments which have been and are being conducted by people who are far more qualified to conduct them than we are. Again, real experience is a variety of careful experiments. Notice it's not doing something and seeing what happens. No. It's not even just one careful experiment. It is a variety of careful experiments made with the mind freed from prejudice and uncontrolled by previously established opinions and habits. The results are marked with careful solicitude and an anxious desire to learn, to improve, and to reform on every habit that is not in harmony with physical and moral laws. Notice, it's not just doing something, seeing what happens. In other words, it's not just about subjecting something to your senses. No, that's the type of experience that is not reliable, merely subjecting something to your senses. No, we need real, genuine scientific experiments, and we need to be marking the results with careful solicitude. It's not just being haphazard. No, it has to be very carefully dealt with, like how it's done by actual scientists doing actual experiments. Like, that's what Ellen White is actually talking about here. She's talking about actual experiments and how they are really to be conducted in contrast to what people usually term experience. Again, Ellen White says, the idea of others gainsaying what you have learned by experience seems to be folly and even cruelty itself. Okay, so that's coming to the whole pride thing again, right? Where we think that our own experience can't be gainsaid by others. We think, who are you to tell me that my experience is not reliable? Mr. or Mrs. Scientist, who are you to tell me? Well, who they are to tell you is someone who knows more about it than you do. That's what we have to realize, that it's not all about us and our experience. No, it's about material reality, and they very may well be someone who can tell us something about it. When we say something like that, when we say something like, who are you to tell me? What we are doing in that moment is saying to that person, my judgment is more valuable than yours in regard to this because of my personal experience. That's what we're saying when we say things like, who are you to tell me? No, let's not say things like that. That's an awful mindset. That's not a mindset that cares about truth. That's a mindset that cares about defending and protecting our own personal biases and perspectives. Let's never say things like that. Their judgment may be just as valid or more valid than our judgment. So let's hear what they have to say. Let's not challenge them. Who are you to tell me? No. If they are an individual who has a real education in regards to X, whatever the topic may be, health, archaeology, biology, chemistry, astrophysics, whatever, let's not be so proud as to assert our own personal opinion above their education, which is based on actual experiment rather than just going by preferences. Like in medical science, it's simply not the case that people are saying, well, let's just do this. No, things are regulated. There's standards. There are experimental standards. And yes, sure, there are times where individuals will violate those standards and will fall short of those standards, but that's condemned by the field at large, and people who discard those standards suffer the repercussions and often lose their licenses and all of these sorts of things. The field itself is rigorous and scientific, and that's a good thing. We should value that far more than our own experience. And yes, I understand, and Ellen White certainly understood, that it can seem folly to have others gainsay your experience, and it can seem like even cruelty itself. But don't you hear the counsel of the true witness through Ellen White telling you that that doesn't matter? The fact that it seems folly, the fact that it seems like cruelty itself does not matter. It doesn't change physical reality. That we shouldn't use the fact that it just doesn't feel good for someone to be able to tell us that our experience is not valid. We shouldn't use that as some sort of reason for propping up our own experience above scientific experimental data. So again, Ellen White, this is what she says. The idea of others gainsaying what you have learned by experience seems to you to be folly and even cruelty itself. But there are more errors received and firmly retained from false ideas of experience than from any other cause. That's a statement worthy of contemplation. People having a false idea of experience. So, for example, let's just take archaeology. Let's say you grew up believing in the Exodus as a real historical event, and someone comes along and gives you a video, a DVD, that is presenting what is supposed to be evidence in favor of the Exodus. And there's people saying, oh, well, archaeologists have found this and that, and it's confirming your belief. And you consider that genuine experience, a genuine way to come to knowledge. You watch this DVD and people seem like they knew what they were talking about, and it's confirming what you always knew to be true. Is that how it's done? Is that genuine experience? No, that's the type of experience that is merely habit and indulgence, blindly and frequently ignorantly followed. When we see a video that is presenting evidence that's just confirming what we believe, and we just go with it, that is a form of indulgence. It's also what is known as confirmation bias. We have a bias in favor of things that confirm our previously held opinions. That's not genuine experience. Remember, real experience is a variety of careful experiments made with the mind freed from prejudice and uncontrolled by previously established opinions and habits. So if someone comes to you and presents to you an archaeological DVD that confirms to you beliefs that you've already had, don't just take it and believe it because it confirms what you say. No, be critical of what it says. Do your experiment to find out, is what they are saying actually backed rigorously, scientifically, in material reality? And finding a wooden wheel at the bottom of the sea isn't the same as confirming the Red Sea crossing, for example. Just saying, like, you could say, oh, well, that's material reality, it's a wheel. Well, have there been real experiments in order to establish where it's from, how it got there, etc., etc., etc.? Has there been a knowledge of the principles involved in the action? Or are we just interpreting it as, oh, this is what it is because it confirms our belief, when maybe it ended up at the bottom of the sea for totally different reasons at a totally different time? And there's ways to test that. Like, oh, well, what was wheel design at this time versus that time? There's lots of ways things could be scientifically tested. So we have to actually do those experiments rather than just going with it because it agrees with us. That's not a genuine experience. Let's not go with something just because it agrees with us. In fact, if we find ourselves kind of going with something because it happens to agree with us, let's take a step back and say, wait a second, do I actually know this? Do I actually really have genuine experimental knowledge related to this? So again, because of that false idea of experience, Ellen White, she says here, there are more errors received and firmly retained from false ideas of experience than from any other cause. So if your idea of experience lacks genuine scientific experiment, you may think that you have learned things by experience that you have not actually learned. You have not actually gained a genuine knowledge, and you may receive errors and firmly retain errors by that means. The only way to not do that is to become genuine experimentalists who require rigorous scientific experimentation in order to establish reality. Again, Ellen White says there are more errors received and firmly held from false ideas of experience than from any other cause, for the reason that what is generally termed experience is not experience at all, because there has never been a fair trial by actual experiment and thorough investigation with a knowledge of the principles involved in the action. So just for another example, people may watch creationist videos and hear creationists saying things like, oh, well, God just spoke and something didn't exist and it just popped into existence. And they may say, see, this, quantum physics proves this to be the case, that consciousness is really fundamental to reality and that therefore God could speak and it come about. And we might hear that and it sounds really good. Like, oh, wow, so you're telling me that quantum physics is confirming something that the Bible says and something that I've believed my whole life? Wow, yeah, that's great. And we just go with it without actually knowing anything about quantum mechanics and whether it at all indicates that someone could just speak and something come from nothing. Furthermore, what does that even mean for something to come from nothing? Do we have any sort of genuine knowledge about what that is? Is that even in harmony with the laws of physics? Because Ellen White is one of her criteria for something being a real experience versus not a real experience is whether it is in harmony with physical law. So the point is that people buy into things because it agrees with their perspectives. I have bought into things because it agreed with my perspective. I'm sure each one of you on the call and each one listening to this later has bought into certain ideas because it agrees with your perspectives at the time of hearing those ideas. And then we end up going forward making claims as though we know something when we really don't. So rather than just concluding, oh yeah, quantum physics totally shows ABC because it agrees with us, before coming to believe something like that, we should say, this person's making this claim. Is that actually what quantum physics indicates? And then we have to assess, are we going to take the time to find out, to conduct actual experiments? And if we are going to take that time, then we will be able to actually know. If we are not going to take that time, then we should humbly confess our ignorance and not form beliefs or make claims based upon these pleasing sounding ideas. Anyway, I hope that this is a good start to really understanding experience not reliable. We have been on for nearly an hour and a half now, so we should bring the call to an end. Does anyone have any comments or questions concerning what we have discussed? Okay, well, I'm not hearing anyone with anything. So that said, would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
Dear Heavenly Family, we thank you for reliable experience. Thank you for what we learned tonight. We love you. We know you love us more than we can ever love you. In the name of the branch, we thank you and praise you. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, we love you all and hope that you really consider the contents of this testimony, and we will pick up where we left off tomorrow night. So happy Sabbath and have a good night.